It's so good to see all of you today. And I have been following some of you on uh, WhatsApp, on Twitter, on Facebook. And it's always nice to look at old comrades and their statements. I would like to start with paying my small tribute to Swami Agnivesh, who has been a friend of uh, children and who has been a supporter to various child rights movements in the country. Uh, and I often remember that whenever we had asked him to come and support us in a program, he did it without any hesitation. And there were issues when, say, one of the children uh, uh, who died while at work in a quarry mine, and we told him that he would come. He came immediately, unquestioningly. And we were not such a big organization. Nobody even knew about our existence. But we had to just write a letter to him. And he sensed that it was a good work and he gave us support. So in a way, I think today we shall remember Swami Agnivesh. There's one statement that he made, which I always remember about child labor, which he said was, every child labor is a bonded labor. That I think is a very, very profound statement. We had made so many distinctions between child labor and hazardous, non-hazardous. But he said you should not even make a distinction between child labor and bonded child labor. All child labor are bonded. And I think it is that statement that we remember today when we remember him and we pay our respects to him. I'm also happy that I'm sharing this platform with you. Many of you have been fellow travelers who have fought for some of the most progressive of laws in the country. I couldn't be happier than this occasion where I'm sharing the platform with each one of you. I do not know what more I can tell you than what we can do together, what we share together to fight for radicalization of the Child Labor Act. Although there has been one or two compromises, I think it is our coming together with the CACL fighting day in and day out, bringing up the issue that we have been able to get an amended Child Labor Act to include even adolescent children, which I think is a good progress. The progress is also on. There's so many progresses that we have made together as fellow travelers. And I thought we should sort of not become cynical considering the kind of times that we are in. And remember the strengths that we've drawn from the community, the strengths we've drawn from the youth, the strengths we've drawn from the self-help groups, from the Gram Panchayats. None of us would not be sitting here today talking about children's rights. We didn't have the community support with us. But for the community, but for their sacrifices, but for their relentless work, but for what they have done day in and day out, we couldn't have achieved whatever we achieved. So today when we're talking about community, I think we're talking about all those who have given strength to do more and more. And we cannot give up. To see the kind of strength they gave for children to exercise agency. When children know that they're being talked about, when children know that the community is discussing them at bus stops, at the bore well, when they know that they're being discussed at a wedding, when they know that somewhere that they are the point on which people are coming together, children also gain courage. And we know stories of how children have exercised agency, have because of the kind of community support that there is in. They have defied the power structures. They have defied the exploiters. They have defied those who have arranged their marriages, and they have walked out of their horrible past to pursue education. So when we're talking about community, we must remember the strength of the community. That if you repose faith in the community, if you repose faith in their capacities, they will go ahead much more than what you and me can imagine. And in fact, they challenge us. They ask us, can you run as fast as we can? We can do anything for children and their lives. but are you ready? They're not just challenging you and me, they're challenging the system. Often people talk about the challenges and the barriers children face to access education. And I think here we should ask the question, who is challenging whom? I think it is a hungry child who is challenging the system. It's a child who has not learned anything who's challenging the system. It's a child who's working, he's challenging the system. He is asking the system the basic question, do you care? Do you really want me to survive? Do you really want to give me dignity? So every child who has been denied uh, his rights, I think that child is not who is challenged as much as the state that is challenged. Every minute they're challenging the state and they're exposing the state. They're telling the state, you've done nothing. You're good for nothing. You don't care. And you better buck up. You put your act together. You put your system together. We want that we have failed. The state has failed. I'm saying this because new education policy, they talked about a whole lot of things. One is about the learning crisis. The crisis is not in that children are not learning. The crisis is in the system. The crisis is in the system, inability to reach out children, to respect them, to respect the first generation. And that there is a systemic gap, I think is what we are questioning. I'm rambling. Sorry, I'm not talking with any specific note. I'm so happy. And what does the system say? Why is it say? What does it say that why it cannot do things? We know that the system is being challenged every minute, and it comes up with the same set of excuses all the time. The system says, "Look, you're so poor. It's poverty." In fact, recently there were discussions on extending the age of marriage from 18 years to 21 years for girls. And many of the studies of very eminent child rights activists have also said child marriage is because of poverty. I think poverty is a huge excuse, which in fact, which is the argument which we made even when we talked about child labor. Child labor is not about poverty. Child marriage is not about poverty. It is about state inaction. It is about the state not acting when a child's right is being violated. If there were schools, if there were hostels, if there were facilities, if the state showed that it cared for children, I don't think child marriage would have occurred. I don't think child labor would have occurred. So somewhere I think poverty is really not a right answer. Child poverty, yes, they are poor, but are poor children responsible for what they are, for where they have been born? Are poor children, do they have a choice? They say that I will be born in a rich family. Children don't have choices into where they are being born, into what caste, into what family. And it is for the state to take care of children wherever they are born. So, we will have to question the issue of child poverty and saying that children can never be held responsible for their poverty. They are not to be held accountable for their poverty. They are not to be held responsible. And it is a state that has to be act. Now, once I start saying that the state has to act, the other very clever thing that many bureaucrats come up with, politicians come up with, you're not being practical. See, there is one poverty argument that stops from things happening by those who are in the establishment. The other thing that constantly comes in the thing is that it is not practical. I think we should question the issue of practicality. Whose practicality are you talking about? Is it practical for a child to be hungry? Is it practical for a child to be malnourished? Is it practical for a child to be trafficked? Is it practical for a child to have ill health? Is it practical for a child to be insulted and humiliated? Is it practical for a child to be discriminated? Just because you don't want to do, the state doesn't want to do. You have to question the state. blame it on saying it is impractical for children. We will constantly have to combat the argument of poverty. We have to constantly combat the argument of practicality. And the third argument, which all of us have been combating. These are the three arguments that are made everywhere by those who are activists and also by those who are non-activists, academics. The third argument is tradition and culture. There cannot be a more dangerous argument than the argument of it is tradition, it is culture, there is not much you can do. So let the potter be a potter, let the artisan be an artisan, let child marriages go on, let child abuse go on, because it's a tradition, because it's a culture. No. If this is a tradition and culture, we dump this tradition and culture. We want traditions and culture that respect children and their rights. And this is a constitutional guarantee that we are talking about. We want new traditions and cultures. We want traditions, and we are not saying we are against all traditions. A society that progresses creates new traditions, creates new cultures, and we let us create new traditions. Let us create new cultures, and let us create a new world where children are respected. So what I'm trying to say is that never fall into the trap of having to say that children are poor, that it is not practical to protect children, and that it is tradition. All these three arguments are faulty. They are only to justify uh, abuse of children, and we are not going to allow these arguments to go on. Never, even by mistake, say children are poor. Never, even by mistake, say that it is not practical. You can build flyovers. How did that become practical? You could have a monorail. How did that become
कहाँ से आया ये
practical? You could
पाँच तो
send
रिमाइंडर हो
some
जाएगा
rocket to the moon. How did that become practical? So you have to decide what is practical and what is not practical. And don't fall into the trap of tradition and culture. I do not want anyone
कहाँ
of
से
you
ये कैसे चला गया ये
can you please ask them to mute? I mean, sometimes
सेकंड्स में
it's
कैसे चला
disturbing.
तुमको अगर चेक करना है
Kindly,
और इसको
everyone kindly mute please.
Om Arya and others have to mute. Om Arya, mute yourselves.
Vasu also should mute. There may
Yeah, I will mute now.
I'm sorry for this, for this, but basically what I'm saying is children are not responsible for poverty. It is impractical for a child to be remaining without rights. That you cannot punish a child in the name of tradition and culture. Let us expose this. And therefore, when we are talking about community structures, when we are talking about community support, we will have to tell the community that there is a fallacy in all these arguments. Because even the community sometimes says, "Hum garib hai." Actually, you don't blame the community. They say what we think. We have given the script for the poor. Their script is never allowed to come out. What the poor feel, what the poor think is what I think we have to create conditions for them to speak the truth. We have created I'm not saying we in the meaning you and me. I'm talking about the larger society has created a script which is internalized by the poor also, and who think perhaps that is the truth. Let us say that this is not the truth. What you really want is your child to be happy. What you really want is your child to be studying. We know that. So it is people who are manufacturing these ideologies. It is people who are manufacturing these thoughts. They will have to be exposed. We will have to expose their double standards. While for the rich, tradition and culture does not matter. Why is it the tradition and culture is important only for the poor? We will have to expose the double standards that there are in the country today, and we will have to stand by children. I'm talking especially children of the marginalized communities, those who have been impoverished. And there's one more thing: don't say poor. I think that there's a loss of call them as poor children. Let's be ideologically correct. These are children who are impoverished. When you say poor, then you're not blaming anybody. When you say impoverished, you don't say poverty, you say impoverishment. Then you say impoverished by whom? Impoverishment by whom? Then you pin the structural factors, the structural inequities, you pin the gaps in the laws and policies. I think we should use the word impoverishment and not use the word poverty, because poverty is so neutral. It does not even tell you who is at fault. I mean, these are some of the things I thought I should share with you on what I'm thinking of late, because you are my comrades, you are fellow travelers, you're also grappling with the problems that we're grappling. I thought one should grapple with the ideological problems and the script and the vocabulary that is used. And I think we'll have to question, interrogate the we are talking about. And in this, I would go to the final thing about what I'm saying, given this kind of a structure of ideas that I have, that I think all of us have too, that what are we asking for? What we are asking for is decentralization. And we have seen decentralization works. Decentralization has worked in Kerala. Decentralization has worked when Gram Panchayats took the agenda all over the country. I couldn't say here and there. Karnataka has done very well on decentralization. Decentralization has worked when the Sarpanch has decided to track every child in the village and the ward members are together. So I should think that when we are talking about community, when we are talking about decentralization, then children's rights are protected. Why am I saying this? At the level of Gram Panchayat, at the level of community, children are not numbers. Children are not statistics. Children are names. Children are faces. Children are sensuous reality. Children are happiness. Children are sadness. Children are angry. Children are something that brings out the best in your mind. So you have a particular. So when we talk about decentralization, we're actually talking about planning for every child in mind. And statistics, it becomes numbers at the level of, say, a block. It becomes percentages by the time it goes to the level of district and state and national level. It becomes a sample by the time it becomes a national level. But we are not looking at that. We want decentralization. We want Gram Panchayats to be empowered, because at that level, children are names and faces. And unless there is a planning for every child, nothing can be done. And for this kind of planning, we do have, I mean, today's meeting is about that. You have a DCP2, you have an ICPS system. At every village, there's a child protection committee, and it is empowered by a policy. And we will have to sort of see that child protection committee, like the Gram Panchayat, like in some places a village health committee, mothers committee. There has to be a horizontal network of all the frontline workers with the child protection committee. They have to have a network of the teachers, of the ASHA workers, of the Anganwadi workers, of the Gram Panchayat members, of the ward members, of the self-help group members, of the Dalit groups, the Adivasi groups, the youth groups. There are so many vibrant civil society organizations either child protection committee has to sort of network. And don't ask the question, why are there so many committees? I think the more the number of committees, the better. Sometimes when one committee does not work, at least there is another committee that will work. If there is a weak school management committee, you can at least run to a Gram Panchayat committee. But if all committees were in one, then you won't be able to rectify a dysfunctional system. So I think we should ask for as many committees as possible. It's perfectly all right to have many, many committees at the local level and bring them on children's rights protected. And also an atmosphere where we learn to engage with the system. You see, it is so important to work in tandem with the system. You know, if you cannot work in isolation, ultimately it is a state and the state's responsibility to protect children's rights. It's not the responsibility of you and me. We can only link the community to the system. And I think the process of access to the rectification. Only when you access the system, you see the systemic gaps. Then you mobilize people. Then you question. Then you bring together. Then you say, this is what has to be done. So I think this, at the grassroots level, these horizontal associations that we are engaged with are very important. I mean, let us not undermine their importance. In fact, they're so these institutions, the deepening of democracy happens in systems on the ground. Let us not be cynical about them.
I think Madam is struck, I think.
The network has gone at
Okay.
Shantha Sinha's end. She disappeared also.
Yeah, the connection was bad, I think.
Yeah.
Then for the speakers, I think we can go by alphabetical order of the states, as I have mentioned in the invitation. So let's start with Andhra Pradesh, Mr. Roshan.
I'm sorry, it got.
Yes, ma'am.
It seems to have got disconnected.
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
sorry,
For the
it got
past 2
disconnected.
minutes, we couldn't hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, but I'll end also. I mean, I'm taking up too much of your time. There's such wonderful people here who have to speak, so I will not take up any more of your time. I was just telling you that we must demand for greater budgets. If children are important, their budgets are even more important. None of the institutions that are meant for children should become sites for contestation of resources. As far as children are concerned, they must not think that children should be competing for resources with others. It should come to them naturally. Why must children compete for resources for education, for child protection? None of the institutions meant for children, either the school or the Anganwadi center or the DCPS, should become sites for contestation of resources. Any political party must have this in them, that this is these institutions, that there is a consensus about this institution, and you cannot compete. Nobody can compete with children for resources. I mean, that is what is happening at the moment. They're all competing for resources and denying children their resources. That cannot be, and that must not be. There is so much of state complacence. I wouldn't even say state inaction. I wouldn't even say state deficit. I think that state is complacent sometimes. Sometimes one is worried about it. But still, we must continue to engage with the system, continue to engage with the state in the hope that change will happen. And I'm sure change will happen. Just one last point. I know all of you will talk about it. I don't know. I went off tangent perhaps. I didn't talk to you much about COVID and children and their rights. But you know what is happening on the ground. You're in touch with your groups. You're in touch with the wonderful work many of them are doing. You're in touch with the hunger that is on the ground. You're in touch with the malnutrition that is under the ground. And you're in touch with the fact that children's voices are not being heard. You're in touch with the fact that those who are working for children, the frontline workers, are being totally invisibilized. Even the ASHA worker or the Anganwadi worker who has to work for the child are now put onto the tasks of doing COVID-related work. So I think we cannot allow for this. We will have to bring back children on the agenda. I will not go in, it is what children are going through. I don't have to tell you that, but I must tell you that unless we put our voices together, unless there are joint petitions on one or two issues where all of us say in everywhere that this must happen, I don't think things can change. For example, many states have announced midday meal program. It ran well for 2 months and after that is withered. It's not doing continuously, it is not going on. Sometimes the meals come continuously for 15 days, then suddenly nothing happens. So I think we will have to think of one or two issues on wherein all of us lend our voice. This is a forum for Child Protection Committee. I think we can all come together on saying that the DCPUs will have to be empowered and will have to be strengthened. So I do not know, unless we collectively put our minds together, we can't come up with just one or two issues. Too many issues, again, I think is somewhere dilutes the program, although all issues are equally important. I do hope that you have good set of deliberations. I do hope that you bring children back into democracy in the country. And I thank you very much, Victor. Thank you very much, Pope, India, and the group for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. I won't continue more because I don't know when my line will go off. So thank you very much.